All right, folks, time for another Bearded Wonder Explains. Last time we talked about the Northern Campaign. That's basically Boston, Saratoga, Bunker Hill, and Trenton, Battle of New York City. So today we're focusing on the Southern Campaign of the American War for Independence in our conflict and compromise, mostly conflict in this case, unit. So let's review a little bit. So the objectives of the colonies and the empire were basically the colonists wanted to get Britain to recognize their independence. Originally, it was self-rule, but eventually becomes independence after the Declaration of Independence. And the empire wants to crush the rebel scum. Basically, their goal is to get control of their colonists. The problem is that that's not actually the only objective that they have. There is actually an even more important objective that we almost never talk about as Americans because we like to think that everything is about us. And the reality is that it's not. The number one goal of the British Empire was to keep its sugar colonies. Those are in, south of the continental or the North American colonies. They're down in the Caribbean. And that's because those colonies made more money for Britain than the 13 colonies did. And so if they were forced to pick between one and the other, they would definitely pick the sugar colonies. So from 1775 to 1777, they're fighting in the North mainly because they feel like they can do both. However, the reality is fighting in the Northern Campaign put all of their ships and other things like that far too far away from their sugar colonies. And when they're starting to think that France might join the battles, what France might start fighting, the British are concerned that France is going to use this as an excuse to take away their sugar colonies in the Caribbean as well. And so they make the decision to actually move to the Southern Campaign. There are other reasons for it as well. They felt like they had stronger loyalist support in the South, that more Southern colonists, people in Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, that those colonies were a little bit more loyal, and so they were hoping to get more support that way. But to be honest with you, in a global kind of a perspective, the number one reason for it is they wanted to protect those sugar colonies. So, talk about the Southern Campaign. We're talking about Charlestown. Charlestown was named after King Charles II. The colonists, after the War for Independence, renamed the city Charleston because they didn't want it to be as British, named after a king and all that. And so we have the Battle of Charlestown, and the first one is a confrontation between Colonel Moultrie and the British Navy. And so early on, Britain tried to gain control of Charlestown. They did it by sending 9 warships to Charlestown, and they wanted to basically control the harbor. And if they controlled the harbor, then you control the city. And if you control the city, you basically control the entry point to the south. The colonists, led by Colonel Moultrie, were forced to defend their fort at the mouth of Charlestown with whatever they could find. And so if you've ever been to Charleston or anywhere in the South Carolina beaches, you'll see a lot of these palmetto trees. They cut the palmetto trees down to kind of reinforce the fort. That's all they had. And what ended up happening, because they're so spongy, is that when they built their fort out of these freshly cut palmetto logs, the cannonballs actually bounced off. It's almost like throwing a metal ball at a sponge. Rather than cutting through it, they just kind of sunk in and then plop, went right down. And so the colonists Literally, the story goes that they were listening to see what effect their fire was having, and all they heard was the colonists laughing at them because these cannonballs are bouncing off. They send their ships in closer to destroy the fort, and they actually get stuck on sandbars. The harbor at that point was too shallow, and the ships got stuck. And when they got stuck, they became sitting targets. And so they're not moving anymore, a lot easier to hit that way. And so the colonists actually picked up the cannonballs that were fired at their fort that were just kind of laying there in the sand, picked them up, put them back in their own cannons, and shot them back at the British Navy. And eventually, 5 of the 9 ships are destroyed, and the remainder of them retreat. This is where South Carolina gets its flag from, the moon being the symbol for Colonel Moultrie, and the palmetto tree being a key part of that particular battle. So, later on, the British do get control of Charleston. And one of the key people that kind of comes to be in control is a man named Banastre Tarleton. And Tarleton was known for his brutality. He was not the kind of guy you wanted to fight against. At the Battle of the Waxhaws, the colonial forces surrendered. And normally when you surrender, you're supposed to be given quarter, which means basically that you're taken to a prison camp or something else like that. And Tarleton ordered that they all be killed. And this was sort of common for Tarleton. He was pretty brutal. He would go into towns, lock people in churches, burn the churches down, other things like that. He was not a very popular person. So even though the British Empire wins the Battle of the Waxhaws, it causes a lot of people in the Carolinas to kind of start to turn against the British. Eventually, Washington sends one of his kind of favorite generals, Horatio Gates, the hero from the Battle of Saratoga. He's sent to the South, gets involved in a battle in Camden, South Carolina, the Battle of Camden, and he gets his butt kicked and literally leaves. And so Horatio Gates goes back north after one battle, and the British kind of keep going. And so they move north to Kings Mountain, which is a mountain on the border of North and South Carolina, about 20 miles west of Charlotte, where Charlotte is today. And basically the colonists, the militia there, called the Overmountain Men, these are frontiersmen. These are guys that hunt deer and other things like that for a living. They're very familiar with the woods. And so it's a pretty small force, but basically what they do is they kind of creep around the British and just completely surprise them. And so there was a major victory for the colonial forces at Kings Mountain. The British try to surrender, and the colonists aren't having it. They remember the Battle of the Waxhaws. They refuse quarter and kill most of the British as well. So then Banastre Tarleton is sent away from General Cornwallis to go ahead in and try to put down some of these uprisings and other things like that. He's really good at that. And basically, the colonial forces at this point are being led by Nathaniel Greene, who was another one of Washington's favorite kind of leaders. And Nathaniel Greene sends Daniel Morgan at the Battle of the Cowpens. And so the forces collide there, and Daniel Morgan wins a big battle against Banastre Tarleton. It's a major kind of turning point, if you will. The British sustain heavy losses, and things are looking better for the colonists. But it's definitely not game over yet. Cornwallis still has most of his army intact and decides to move up into Virginia to try to put down that. There had been no fighting in Virginia. Nathaniel Greene kind of plays this cat and mouse game where he refuses to get pinned down. He just kind of, again, looking at those advantages that we talked about of the war for independence, right? If you're a militia, one of your strengths is you just kind of disappear whenever you can't win, or whenever the situation is not favorable for you to fight. And so they kind of do that. Eventually Cornwallis gives up and heads to a town called Yorktown. Basically, he's trying to get close to the ocean because the British have the biggest navy in the world, and they are counting on that naval support. So he kind of feels like if he gets stuck, he can always just get on a boat and go somewhere else. Nathaniel Greene and George Washington kind of join forces at this point, and surround him at Yorktown. And so he's waiting for the British Navy to come and get him. The problem is that they never show up. The French Navy actually comes and fights against the British. If you remember back to world history, the 7 Years' War, that's what created the proclamation line and all of that stuff in the first place. A major war between the British and the French. We called it the French and Indian War. But basically the British won that war big time. And it actually helps the French in the war for independence because so many of their ships were destroyed that they had to build all new ones. And the ones that they built were better than the old British ships that the British were keeping from like 20 or 30 years ago because they won. And so the French had a more modern navy, and actually it's not that big of an underdog kind of a thing because they have better technology. So they never show up. And because they don't show up, Cornwallis is surrounded now by the French Navy and the colonial forces, and has no option but to surrender at the Battle of Yorktown. When Cornwallis surrenders, he surrenders a pretty large army. It's one of the two major armies left in the colonies. And at that point, the British just kind of decide that, you know what, this isn't worth fighting any longer. Again, remember that French factor. They're still worried about their sugar colonies, and they decide, you know what, we can still trade with the United States of America and still make money that way and make money on our other colonies. Let's just end the fighting. And so the American War for Independence, the Battle of Yorktown is actually over in 1781. They don't sign a peace treaty for another year and a half at the Treaty of Paris, but the major hostilities, the major fighting is done at that point, and everybody kind of gets what they want. So that's the Southern Campaign and the end of the American War for Independence. I hope you have a good day.